Oh, hello. Welcome to History of Economic Thought 2, part 2 of our lecture on new institutional economics. We're just reading this great paper. I highly recommend it. It really is a great paper. And we're going to talk about today why it is great and what it is that this paper really says. And it's not the Coase theorem. So we're going to move today in this lecture to discuss the world of costly transacting, positive transaction costs that are positive. And this is the world that Coase wants us to contemplate, and this is what he wants us to incorporate into our economic theory. Well, what are transaction costs? Well, once again, transaction costs are the costs of, let me get this down. This is important, of course. Transaction costs would be the costs of, first of all, defining property rights. Coase doesn't fully get this when he first writes the paper, but it's then pointed out to him by some of his followers that that's really what this is. And he says, yeah. So we have the costs of defining property rights. The costs of finding opportunities for trade, and exchange, the costs of bargaining, negotiating, the costs of specifying the terms of the trade. Recall that that was a problem for the Soviets with their success indicator problem. And then problems of enforcing contracts and rights more generally. And transaction costs are involved in all of the costs of all of those. So all of this is about defining, establishing, and then transferring property rights. All of those actions are costly to do, and therefore none will ever be done perfectly or completely. We can't live in a world of costless transacting. There's an increasing marginal cost involved in this, and that means that not all margins are going to be equated the way that we equate margins in, say, Menger's economizing model. And at some point, the additional costs of specifying rights, of bargaining and doing these things will outweigh the gains. And so it would be inefficient to fully satisfy the marginal conditions. It would be inefficient to perfectly specify property rights. Now, this is, of course, closely related to information costs. You have to find the trade partners, you've got to spot the opportunities and things like this, specify the terms. Well, today it's been calculated that in the United States, over 1/2 of economic activity is devoted to reducing transaction costs. So we have things like people like middlemen, we have brokers, salespeople, attorneys, etc. Sometimes I think attorneys raise transaction costs, but be that as it may. A great deal of economic activity does not fit well into the standard blackboard neoclassical model. Now, Coase has already shown, as we saw in the previous lecture, that in the world of costless transacting, the zero transaction cost world, Pigou's solution is irrelevant because externalities won't exist. It's costless to bargain them away. And the next thing we'll see is that in the world of costly transacting, Pigou's solution is wrong. It might help, but it could make things worse. Now recall what the objective also is. It is efficiency, or trying to get the maximum net value from the available resources or factors of production. And of course, in the world of costless transacting, bargaining ought to be able to solve every economic problem. But in a world of costly transacting, that's no longer true. Some bargaining problems and some contracts might be too costly. Here's an example of that. And that is, already on the board, but the factory smoke problem. Suppose that we have This is the steel production, the private marginal cost, but they also put out units of, that's the cost of steel, the demand for steel, but they also put out smoke. And when we add that damage into account from the smoke, we get a different marginal cost curve here, the social marginal cost, as Pigou calls it. And supposing this factory, we'll have it now be a couple of factories, and they're damaging 10,000 homes. Well, here's the problem. How do you get the homeowners who have been damaged together? How do you measure the damage? Like, which polluter was responsible? How do you identify the polluters and each one's share of the damage? All those things would be costly. And notice the reciprocal nature of the problem. There wouldn't be any damage if the homeowners didn't build their houses near the factory. So they both cause the problem. In fact, the problem is that we could see that instead of a negative externality, there's a positive externality. Pollution abatement, doing something, if the factory undertakes costly measures to reduce pollution, that's a benefit to the homeowners. It's a positive externality. They can't collect for it. The abatement is positive. So here's some possible solutions. In a costless world of costless transacting, the homeowners, if they have the right to be pollution-free, could pay the firms to cut back on production, to move from there to there. Or the firm could pay the homeowners for the damage, or the firm could install scrubbers, or to take the damage out of to take the chemicals out of the smoke, or smoke out of the emissions, or the homeowners could get together and pay for the scrubbers. Or they could all somehow agree to use a different kind of paint for the houses that doesn't get damaged by the smoke. Something. They find the least cost solution. In a world of costless transacting, that's what they would do. Coase then points out that, of course, government can be seen as a super firm that can compel obedience and solve this problem, because it's very difficult to get all of these together. It's very costly to get them together. But, says Coase, no solution is costless, including government intervention. So that's the fundamental problem. No solution is costless. Second point is that the least cost solution will probably be adopted if people are free to choose, because people will maximize their benefits. And sometimes doing nothing might be the least cost solution. Government laws and regulations and assignment of liability might help solve the problem, but there's no reason to assume that putting on regulation or assignment of liability will be the low-cost way of doing things. And, says Coase, since government has very little competition, it might well be higher cost. Government tends to not worry very much about the costs it imposes on others, government decision makers. And, as we will see, the way that rights are assigned will matter very much in a world of costly transacting, our world, unlike the world of costless transacting. Imagine for a moment. Suppose that we have this problem. We'll call it an externality. Smoke is damaging homes, and so we go to court, and the court decides the factories have a right to pollute. What will happen? Well, very likely pollution will continue. And if the the court instead rules that homeowners have the right to be pollution-free, what will happen? Well, they'll probably shut down the factories. Probably no further bargaining is going to occur. It's too hard to get 10,000 homeowners and multiple factories together and have them work out a bargain when we can't even tell which factory is responsible for which part of the damage. So it's unlikely that's going to happen. So once property rights are assigned, we've just made a decision as to whether there will be factories or not, or damage or not. Coase, in his paper, observes that judges in English common law courts seem to have recognized this and incorporated this kind of thinking into their decisions. So he gives an example, the case Adams versus Ursell, where someone opens a fish and chips shop, but it's near some very nice houses and emits a greasy fog from cooking the fish and chips. And the judge issues a very narrow injunction. The shop is creating value, so the judge doesn't want to shut it down or block it, but does make it move down the street to lower valued property where the damage will be less. And Coase has numerous cases he covers where judges seem to be guided in part by the idea of maximizing the value of resources when they're assigning the unassigned property rights, when it's not clear who has rights. And of course, when Coase does this, it really develops a new field, the field of law and economics. Section 7 of Coase's paper really is about that. And this really almost creates that field. But here's what's really interesting, and that's Section 8. That's Coase's analysis of why the Pigouvian solution is wrong in a world of costly transacting. So let's clear our board for that. And begin. And this is where Coase really becomes critical, and I think deservedly, of Pigou. Pigou does the following. He argues that classical economics, as he calls it, teaches that the free market, the invisible hand, guides self-interest to produce the greatest national dividend and the greatest total welfare of citizens as the whole. But once we see, and I've erased it, a divergence between private marginal cost and social marginal cost, we have to ask, how far is it feasible to improve on natural tendencies? And Coase says what Pigou has done is strictly illegitimate. It's a wrong procedure. Why is that? Well, first, this is Coase speaking now. Pigou takes the status quo as the free market. And it might not be. Next, he identifies an ideal blackboard position. So he identifies something that he says is ideal, the blackboard position, and then he calls for government intervention to go from there to there. And he assumes it can be done. We'll do it this way. Calls for government intervention. But, Coase points out, these so-called natural free market tendencies were often caused by government itself, not the free market. And this ideal might not be attainable, and moving to this might make things worse because Pigou has ignored costs. And here's the example that Coase uses. And I call this Pigou's railroad. So let's take a look at how this operates. Pigou's railroad. And this is the negative externality from a railroad. And so here's the problem. Someone builds a railroad, and the train's running along the track, and this is back in the olden days. So they've got shoveling coal into the engine and heating the boiler, so the train runs down the tracks, and the sparks are coming out, and the sparks are setting fire to woods and crops along the track, doing damage. And Pigou says, look, it's uncompensated damage. The railroad runs these trains, they're setting fire to crops, and state intervention is needed The railroad must be held liable. The free market has failed. And Coase says, well, that's an interesting example. Coase does something that's really kind of dirty here, or unfair, I guess. He actually looks up the laws. And it turns out that in actual law, the state intervened to create this situation because railroads are legally exempted from liability for damage from sparks in England. Huh. That is, the status quo is actually, comes from government intervention, and Pigou simply made up his facts. They're not really facts. But more importantly, Pigou's logic is wrong, because he proposes the railroad should be held liable for damage. And, says Coase, that might reduce wealth and make us poorer rather than increase it. It might make a worse allocation of resources rather than a better one. And so Pigou has failed on his own terms. Here's the example, the way that Coase lays this out. Suppose the railroad is not liable for damages. What happens in this case? Well, let's consider the following. A nice simple example. The number of trains that will be run on the railroad. And here we'll put the total benefit of a train. That's the amount that the railroad will earn from running a train. And then the total cost, private, that's the cost of running the train to the railroad. But then there's also crop damage from the sparks. And we will get then the social gain. Okay, great. Private cost, and add that in, and we get social cost. Put those together, we'll get the social gain. That, of course, comes from the demand side of things. So in Coase's example, suppose they run one train, then the total benefits are $150 of earnings minus $50. It costs $50 to run the train, but there's crop damage. And the crop damage is $60. And so that gives us a social gain of $40. Well, it looks like one train is a good idea. Even taking the damage into account, it's worth it. Okay. What about a second train? If they run a second train per day, the total benefits will be $250. Great, so that next train added $100 of value. So we have falling marginal benefit, downward sloping demand curve, minus $100 in costs. So a constant marginal cost curve for the cost of production of a train, constant marginal cost of running a train. And then, each train will do the same amount of damage, so that next train would do also $60, so $120 of damage. And it looks like then if we add all that up, we get $30. Oh no, look, the marginal social gain here is marginal social gain here would have been 40, but here it's -10. Running the first train got us 40, but the second one loses 10. Well, obviously, it's socially wasteful to have that second train. And obviously, since the railroad is not liable, it ignores this, and it will simply run that second train. Okay? Great. Well, without liability, these are the conclusions. The railroad would run 2 trains a day. The second train was socially undesirable. And so the question is, should the railroad be held liable for the damages so that it will internalize the externality? Should it have to pay those? And Pigou's answer is obviously. Just do the marginal analysis. Simple, right? And Coase puts it this way. That's the irresistible wrong conclusion. You have to look at the real world alternatives, not just the blackboard. Suppose the following. Keep in mind that if the railroad is not liable, the farmer is not going to cultivate land unless the net return is expected to be greater than the damage. The farmer knows that the sparks are going to come out and won't cultivate right next to the railroad track, or will use a fire-resistant crop or something like that. But suppose that the railroad is liable. Now the farmer doesn't care if his or her crops burn at all, because he'll be repaid for it. So they might cultivate right next to the railroad, right next to the tracks. They might use a crop that is more sensitive to fire and more likely to burn and not worry about it. So there will be, says Coase, if the railroad is liable, there will be more cultivation and more fire damage. Great, so we have to look at a different set of numbers for that. Let's switch colors for this. And what we need to change is not that, not that, not that, not that. We need to change those. And Coase says, suppose the following. Since the farmer, if the railroad is liable, then the farmer will change their behavior and more fire-sensitive crops and putting the crop right up next to the tracks, not worrying about whether it burns or not, because they know they get paid back if it does. And so farmers' behavior has changed, and now we have to change the marginal social gain. Marginal social gain right here becomes, oops, negative 20. And here it becomes negative 70. The social gains. Great. So if the railroad is liable, how many trains will we have? 0. And if the farmers are liable for the damage, not the train, then how many trains will we get? 2. Those, says Coase, are the relevant alternatives, not Pigou's imaginary optimum. Human beings respond to incentives, and behavior is not invariant to institutions, to property rights. Behavior is not constant. So that's fundamental. And so, says Coase, the relevant criterion for assigning liability is to compare the total social products of these alternative arrangements. And so we have to compare 0 versus 2 trains, the real world alternatives, if these are the examples that hold. And it's pretty clear then, says Coase, that 2 trains, where farmers plant less, will be better. And we can see that in these numbers, where the total benefit of 2, I guess we'll just write it this way. Total benefit would be 250, that's this gain, minus the $100 in total cost, minus the 120 in the foregone value of the crop. And then, because they're not going to, in this world where the railroad is liable, they've used additional inputs. It says we have to also take into account the value of those inputs in the next best use. And if that happens to be, let's say, I think 150, put those in there. The total gain here should end up being $20, if I've written that right. Great, it's a positive gain. And 2 trains are better than 0. As it turns out, that's probably why Parliament had granted exemptions to railroads for liability for damage from sparks, because otherwise you don't get railroads. But here's the story. property rights very much do matter for allocation. Changing the property right assignment gets you either 0 or 2, gets you either railroads or no railroads, 2 trains or none. And looking at the marginals without considering the totals is a great error. And the objective, says Coase, ought to be to find the alternative that reduces the problem, that creates net benefits without causing greater harm elsewhere in the system. And if all you do is think of private cost versus social cost, you look at only one deficiency and you imply that anything that changes it is desirable. But you have to ask, what is the cost of that? What's the cost of the government intervention? So we have to always think that corrective measures have costs. Does the cost outweigh the benefit? Does it do net harm? And the only way to answer that is to consider real-world alternatives. And Coase actually says something about this on page 43. He says, of his paper. He says, actually, very little analysis is required to show that the ideal world is better than a state of laissez-faire, unless the definitions of a state of laissez-faire and an ideal world happen to be the same. But the whole discussion is largely irrelevant for questions of economic policy, since whatever we may have in mind as our ideal world, it is clear we have not yet discovered how to get to it from where we are. A better approach would seem to be to start our analysis with a situation approximating that which actually exists, to determine the effects of a proposed policy change, and to decide, or to attempt to decide, whether the new situation would be, in total, better or worse than the original one. Ludwig von Mises makes that same point in 1949 in his Human Action, when he says that really when we're considering some sort of an intervention, the only reasonable standard would be, are the benefits of the intervention worth it in the costs that it would impose? And he says no reasonable man could object to that. Well, great. Coase lays this argument out. We have to focus on the real world, not the blackboard nirvana. And this gives rise then to the importance of institutions, property rights, and the new institutional economics. Couple Coase's work with then the collapse of the Soviet Union and the failures of central planning, and soon economists realize institutions matter deeply. Great. Well, this paper is the birth of law and economics. It's the birth of the property rights and transaction cost school. It is the birth of new institutional economics and the birth of new resource economics, which has a very heavy influence in resource and environmental economics and some in agricultural economics. Great. I think it's the best paper ever written on the dangers and illusions of blackboard solutions to manage the economy. It shows the crucial importance of transaction costs and of different kinds of property rights, and also why they will always be limited. Well, great. When Coase writes this paper, it has a tremendous influence and begins to influence other people, and he has a number of followers. I'll mention just a few who are worth noting and about how this takes off. And we'll clear our board. And Archer, and one of the first is, places where this really catches on would be University of Chicago, UCLA, University of Washington. And so this has a very heavy influence in resource economics and again, agricultural economics. These schools are important for that. And so this focus on property rights is important. And first person I'll mention is Harold Demsetz. And I'd mentioned him in the previous lecture, the man who coined the phrase or the term nirvana fallacy, but he uses this analysis to develop a theory of property rights and how those come about. And he observes, first of all, that it's costly to establish property rights Therefore, property rights will always be incomplete, and they will be established as the benefits of establishing property rights go up, or as the costs of establishing them go down. In doing this, he's actually building on a theory that is laid out in Human Action by Ludwig von Mises. And an externality can be seen as unowned property rights or unowned effects or attributes of assets that nobody has claimed. And also a margin over which equating doesn't occur. Great. So here's the way that you might think of this. The way that Mises and Demsetz think of it. Suppose you've got an area, a population living in a certain amount of land, and land is plentiful and the population is small. So nobody really cares about property rights in land. You use a piece of land and then you use it up, just move somewhere else. If your neighbors are too close, move somewhere else. Nobody particularly cares. But with population growth and increasing scarcity of land, the benefits of defining and protecting rights to land will increase, and therefore people will begin developing property rights. They'll start doing things like developing fences, developing property titles, surveys, rules, laws regarding land transactions, etc. Those are all costly, but people, once the value of the land goes up high enough, will begin engaging in them. Another thing that Demsetz shows is that all rights are fundamentally property rights. They are claims to things, including claims to one's own self, including speech, including thought, and including action. So-called human rights are actually property rights. In fact, that's a very old idea. It goes back, for example, to the abolitionists. The abolitionists called slavery man-stealing. It was stealing from a man his own right to himself, his property in himself. Frederick Douglass, if you read Frederick Douglass's book, My Bondage and My Freedom, when I was reading this book for the first time, I was thinking, this guy was a new institutional economist. He understood these ideas very well. So this is all the stuff that, these are the things that Demsetz lays out. But what does this have to do then with institutions? And so with new institutional economics, let's recall Douglass North. Property rights, obviously important, but to a large extent, institutions are simply property rights on a very large scale or general scale. Transaction costs are, again, the cost of defining and trading assets, but that's the cost of defining and trading rights. And a fundamental part of that would be the basic rules of property and contract in a society. Douglass North argues that the institutional framework, as he puts it, is a set of rules that is followed by a society, and in large part, that's the structure of property rights. These are the constraints that people operate under. They define what they can do and what they can't do, what assets they can control, and over what margins. Says North, they will never be perfectly defined, never be perfectly efficient, and they'll be subject to institutional lock-in. Almost never will you see truly revolutionary change. It's hard to change these things. So what does North mean by institutional lock-in? Institutional, we'll put a dash there, lock-in would be things like learning. So people have to have knowledge of the system and how it operates. They have to have habits and behaviors. Those things are hard to change. Those are costly to change. Great. Remember Adam Smith talking about culture and rules. People learn from each other. He says this in the theory of moral sentiments. This is what Smith is talking about. How people learn institutions and then operate within the system they have learned. Hard to change. Another one is these institutions are subject to economies of scale. Network externalities, sometimes called in modern terminology. The more people follow a rule, the harder it is to change. Great. The more people follow the rule, the more useful it is because we know what to expect from others. Suppose, for example, even if everybody thinks we've learned that there's a new rule, a new way of doing things that would be better, economies of scale can make it very hard to change. Suppose for some reason we all suddenly, it's quite fictional, but suppose we all learned that driving on the left-hand side of the road was somehow better than driving on the right-hand side. Even if we all thought, that's a good idea, we'd like to do that, it's very difficult to switch because I don't know what I know that I want to switch sides of the road, but what if you don't? We have to have matching expectations. Otherwise, we're going to do head-ons and things. So switching the side of the road to drive on would be difficult to do. More people following the rule, the harder it will be to change it to a different rule. What's another one? Vested interests. Vested interests, referring, of course, to interest groups who, once a rule is put into place, or once it evolves, exists, there will be oftentimes powerful special interests who will be opposed to changing it. Great. Stephen Chung, put his name up here, has a very nice application or example of this thinking. Stephen Chung, another great economist, follower of Coase, and his theory of institutional change argues that if we look at China and its transition from Marxism to markets that occurred, especially right around 1978, they had very high costs of changing until some things happened that made it possible to change the cost of learning and change the vested interests and the economies of scale, that those things change. New information and new models suddenly became available. New interest groups arose. Old ones were weakened. And the old system was performing less well. And the cost of persuading people to change systems shifted. And that was how China ended up moving from a pretty draconian socialist system to one that featured markets. And in 1981, he used this to predict, Chung used this to further predict China's transition just a few years after it started. And the story that he tells is this, and maybe we'll later tell the story of Chinese economics, but just in a nutshell, during the time of Mao Zedong, Mao's radicalism, you had the Cultural Revolution and the Red Guards, and they were extremely radical. China had a collapsing economy, a time of turmoil, almost civil war, economic decline, and the old system's not working. China is completely isolated from the rest of the world at this time, and then Mao Zedong dies. When Mao Zedong dies, a number of people who were vested interests, officials and bureaucrats, were fed up with Mao's Red Guard, and they supported the People's Liberation Army in violently suppressing the Red Guard. And at that point, they put, because Mao is dead, they put Deng Xiaoping into power. And Deng Xiaoping says, you know, this policy of no contact with the outside world, we look out and we see what's happened to the rest of, to other places. And we suddenly realize how poor our country is compared to Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Singapore. So they have old vested interest is put down, a new one comes up. They have new learning, changes in the economies of scale, and, says Chung, using that, I predict that they will move in a much more market-oriented direction, and China's big growth takeoff begins. Great. So just an application of new institutional economics. Interesting. Well, in some respects, that takes us full circle from where we started in HET 1. If you remember Aristotle arguing with Plato over the nature of property rights, Plato advocates communal ownership of property. Aristotle says private property is going to give superior outcomes and social harmony. And of course, I had quoted this UN official who had said, "The world must learn we can no longer afford private property rights." That turns out to be totally wrong. Adam Smith, from last term, emphasizes property rights, broadly understood, to include things like institutions, including a human understanding of ethics, what one may and may not do. That's crucial if we're going to have a well-functioning society and the wealth of nations. And then we get to Menger, we get to Jevons, and they argue that economics is not really about stuff. It's about all of people's choices. We saw the Soviet example in new institutional economics. The Soviets had labor, they had capital, they had access to technology, technological knowledge, and they didn't get property rights correct at all, and they had a dysfunctional society. Great. Well, there's a great deal of work that can still be done with new institutional economics. It's an area that's just barely been tapped, I think. And hopefully you will make some of you will do some work in that. Great, but it kind of brings us full circle on the issues of institutions and property rights. So in our next lectures, what we'll do is move to another modern development, and that's the development of modern macroeconomics. And we'll see once again that institutions become crucial, and that giving them, and property rights become crucial, and that giving them insufficient attention might be a problem.